Good morning and welcome to your sermon for Sunday, October the 25th, 2020. For those of you who want to read ahead, next week we will be studying about somebody named Abigail, a woman in the Old Testament. You can read about her in 1 Samuel chapter 25. This week we're going to look at a man named Jeremiah, a man who was a prophet of God in the Old Testament. Jeremiah is referred to as the weeping prophet, crying prophet. Not a very good nickname. I guess I could have worse. And if you know my nickname from high school, yes, it is probably a bit worse. But the weeping prophet would probably not be a great nickname either. And he's called the weeping prophet because nothing really good happens to the people that he prophesies to, that he talks to. He's going to speak a message of disaster and suffering and punishment for what Judah has done wrong. His job is summed up in chapter 1 in Jeremiah. He is to decree disaster to Judah and other nations. And not just one time, but for many, many years, this is going to be his job. And God tells him right up front, they are going to fight against you. But God has a solution for this. Maybe not one that Jeremiah always enjoyed, but it was the same one. Endure the punishment that they give you. They are going to harm Jeremiah, the people of Judah, but they will not kill him. We are going to look into chapters 1 and 2 this morning, kind of get the theme of the book and see what we can learn and take away for our lives today and how that can be a blessing to us. In this lesson today, we will see the history of sin, we will see the deception of sin, and we will see the confronting of sin. All that Jeremiah is going to talk about to the people through the words of God. Let's take a look. First of all, we see history, the history of sin. Sin, looking back at the history of sin, helps us see our life in perspective, in how it really is, even though we might have a problem in perceiving how it actually is. So Jeremiah talks about what their life used to be like as a kingdom that belonged to God. God promised Abraham a couple of things, a couple of really big, important, special things. He said that his descendants would be like the sand on the seashore. He also said that through his seed, all nations on earth would be blessed. He gave him some pretty sweet promises. God, as he is carrying that nation along, saves the Israelite people. He saves them from starving. He saves them from the Egyptians. He saves them from starving again. And he saves them from other nations. And he gives them a land that is so beautiful. It's described as flowing with milk and honey. And they have rest from all their enemies. And they are a nation that is set apart to God. That is their history. That is what was. But then we have to look at what is. At this current time, in the state of Israel, they are not one nation. They are actually two nations. You'll notice I'm using the word Judah. Judah was one of the two nations that the whole country of Israel was divided into. They were not one nation anymore. They were two, Israel and Judah. And both of these nations that used to be together have continually chased after other gods. The kings that have served have not been faithful to God. Some have for a period of time, but overall they have not. They have forsaken the Lord their God, and their worship is in vain, and the law of God is pretty much forgotten and is not cared about. It is an afterthought, or maybe something that is only for the priests. So what we have in the description of Jeremiah is really a long, rebellious journey of the people of Israel. God remembers the beginning of their covenant, though. He remembers, and he says, I remember when Israel was holy to the Lord. It's like he's longing after that time, remembering, reminiscing on how wonderful it was. It's when they were one nation and they were dedicated to serving God. We remember that as they came out of Egypt, all the Egyptians were drowned. The shoes that they wore on the way to the Promised Land as they wandered in that desert for 40 years, their shoes never wore out. They ate their fill every day. They kicked out 31 different nations in the land of Canaan and took over that land. God remembers the time of Moses and Joshua, but God uses some imagery for the Israelites that is really not very favorable for them. God uses the imagery of a large, beautiful planted vine. You're like, hey, I thought you said this was not going to be a good illustration. Well, it isn't. God says to the Israelites, I chose to plant you, but you bowed down before the trees. And then he asks them a question, which he does a lot in Jeremiah chapter 1 and 2. And he says to Israel, how did you turn into a degenerate wild vine when I planted you? They turned their back on him. And in fact, God uses the phrase, they turned their back to him instead of their face. They are not in a good position. Israel had troubles. We even see as they were wandering in the desert, they had troubles. But instead of seeking help from God, they grumbled against him. And this language that God uses in describing how they look at him, they won't even look in his direction. They won't face toward God or seek him out at all. And in fact, they turned around. They turned around so that their back is to God. And you know how it's hard to look at someone when we're ashamed of what we've done? That seems to be the imagery that we get here. That Israel couldn't even look towards God because they knew they were ashamed of what they had done. So they turned their back instead of looking to his face. And he uses more imagery in these two chapters. It's very poetic. You might want to read chapters 1 and 2 of Jeremiah. They couldn't even look him in the eyes. Or maybe they just wouldn't. They were ashamed. But instead of changing, they chose to ignore that God was there. Now Israel is going to be shamed by God. This is the whole theme of the book of Jeremiah. And God describes it as a thief is shamed when he gets caught, so Israel is going to be shamed. And there's a series of questions that he asks Judah, the country of Judah, through Jeremiah his prophet. And we're going to look at some of those questions, not all of them, but some of them. Sin deceives us. It really does. It deceives us. God asks the question, who does this? Who does this? God actually compares Israel and Judah to the nations around them. Two of the nations that he uses are Cyprus and Kedar. And he describes them as worshiping worthless idols. But God looks at them and says, but look at them. Even though they worship worthless idols, they're not switching gods all the time. They are at least loyal to these worthless idols that they worship. You have to keep in mind here, Judah, or Israel, which was at the time, had served the living God who made everything. He follows up with the question on who does this, God asking the Israelites. Who says to a tree, you are my father? God had been their father, and yet they exchanged the fatherhood of God for this ridiculousness of a tree being their father. They would give credit to nature for someone birthing them. I don't know if you notice any similarities, but this kind of seems like the theory of evolution to me. Instead of giving credit to God for making everything, just a big bang happened. and then everything evolved and changed, and this is how it is now, giving credit to someone other than God. God follows it up even more, and who says to a stone, "You gave birth to me"? A stone doesn't give birth to anyone. God is taking something ridiculous and showing them the foolishness of how they are living and in whom they are trusting. Even the unbelieving nations around them did better than Israel themselves. God follows up with more questions, highlighting how sin has deceived them and how they've gotten to where they are now. He says to them, "How can you say, 'I am not unclean'? How can you say that?" They had the attitude that they were doing everything right, even though they were disobedient to God in almost every way that He had asked them to be obedient. Inside they knew. On the inside, in their heart, they knew. And God describes them as that they're so dirty that they can't get all the grime off using soap and lye. Kind of makes me think of a mechanic. A mechanic who is working in grease all day, a really greasy job, and then afterwards tries to clean up and get all that dirt and grease and grime off, but it doesn't all come off no matter how hard you scrub. This is a situation of the Israelites. They couldn't get all the grime off, but they denied that they were dirty. They were taking the attitude that they could live their life without God, that He was maybe an inconvenience, or they just didn't want to follow Him for some reason. They were deceived, but they forgot to they just did not understand that God was the one who was prospering them before. And God asked them one more question, getting them to show them that their sin has deceived them. Have you not brought this on yourselves? Have you not brought this on yourselves? God describes the Israelites again. He's very descriptive of the Israelites. They would not accept correction from God. I don't know about you, but when I was younger, there was correction. And we often didn't feel like we had a choice of whether we wanted to accept that correction or not. Now that I'm able to look back on it, I can see how I still did have a choice of whether to accept that correction or to fight even harder against it. Israel has fought harder against it instead of accepting that correction and changing. God had tried to correct them. And it's not that God's correction was faulty. It's just that Israel was utterly defiant. As soon as things were good, then they forgot all about God and they went back to their sinful ways. God would send His prophets to tell them why they were going to be punished. But even after the punishment, they did not remember as to why they got it. They brought disaster on themselves by forsaking God. God was faithful. They were not. They really had the attitude of, "It's not my fault. It's just not my fault. I've had a hard life. I didn't know it was wrong. No one told me that I couldn't do this, and therefore it was permissible." Insert any excuse that you want. But the attitude they took is, "It's not my fault. It's not my fault." Our sin deceives us. It deceives us so that we don't understand how far away from God we really are. And the more that we sin, the more it builds up, and the more that we are deceived. Thirdly, we're going to look at some more questions that God continues to ask to Judah and Israel, and to confront them with their sin. Sin must be confronted. God asked them, "What do you gain by going?" And then He uses two different places that He talks about where they go. What do you gain by going to Egypt? Egypt was known for their strong chariots and their horses and their military strength. And Israel would make alliances with Egypt when other nations would come and threaten them. And then they would usually have to give them stuff or have something that they could offer to Egypt. And Egypt were their neighbors to the south. And then he says, what do you gain by going to the Assyrians? The Assyrians were their neighbors up north, on the other side of them. And the Assyrians were cruel warriors, very powerful military strength. But they would often take advantage of Judah and Israel. And eventually what's going to happen is that nation is going to come and to conquer Israel with God's blessing. Well, what did they gain by going? The question reminds me of something that happened in high school. I had a friend who got really, really angry about something, and they punched a wall. And I think I've told this story before, but the walls that the school that we went to were cement walls. And my friend punched the wall as hard as they could and broke a few bones in their hand. And I always wondered about that. What did they gain by punching that wall? I remember wanting to ask him, do you feel better? What did you gain out of that? What did Israel and Judah gain out of going somewhere else for help? They gained nothing at all. They really had their protector there the whole time, but they would not turn their face to him. If only they remembered the times that God had fought for them. What wrong did your fathers find in me? God continues to ask. How was I so undesirable that they went so far away? Like a breakup, wondering, a relationship breakup. What did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? God hadn't done anything wrong. Their fathers never did find real fault with God. The question that he asks was, what wrong did your fathers find in me? They didn't find any fault in God. In fact, the fault was in them. God describes them as going after worthlessness, and they became worthless. So they got exactly what they went after. They went after worthlessness, and they found it. The riches of this world pass away, but God will endure forever, and we will too if we trust in him. God continues to grill them. Why do you contend with me? Why do you contend with me? A contender is someone that you fight against. And really, in this sense, is someone who you cannot beat. It reminds me of the words that Jesus said to Saul on the road to Damascus. Why do you kick against the goads? It was something that was only hurting him to do, and yet he kept stubbornly doing it. Saul would not admit that Jesus was Lord, even though he knew the Old Testament prophecies about him. Saul did accept Christ and wrote most of the New Testament books that we have with us to today. But he was stubborn, like his fathers before him. Why do you contend with me? God asks them. Israel and Judah, as they are at this time, was worshiping other gods. And they're going to fight against God's prophet Jeremiah. Even though he speaks the very words of God and explains their sin, they are going to fight against him. Sin must be confronted. Well, when we look at the book of Jeremiah, the question that comes to my mind is this: why would we want bad news? I mean, it's a whole book of bad news. This is the story of a nation rejecting God and they're suffering because of it. Why would we want a story like that? It's not very encouraging, it's not very exciting, and it's not very inspiring. But it shows us how someone can fall from so high. And although this is a story of an entire nation, I believe that it's a macrocosm of the relationship that we can have with God. We must evaluate the history that we have with God. Has our relationship with him gotten better? If it has changed, then was it God that changed, or was it us? If we're further away from God now than we were before, guess who moved? Our sin slowly deceives us. It does. until we get to a place in our life where we have to say, what happened? How did I get to this place? When we justify our sin, when we deny it, or we think that it doesn't make a difference in our life anyways, or maybe even deny the existence of God for a while. Our sin slowly deceives us, one piece at a time. But we must confront our sin. We have to deal with it before it gets us to the spot where we realize that we are so far away. It's always something that God calls us to do, even in the Lord's Supper, to examine ourselves. If we do not examine our sin, it will take our life away. We cannot deal with our sin any other way except in Jesus Christ. He paid the price for our sin by dying on the cross for us. He provided a way that we might have forgiveness and to deal with our sin, to confront it. And He gives us the way to come to Him for forgiveness. The story of Jeremiah is a warning to those that deny their sin or they think that it isn't important. God invites you to be faithful to Him today, to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, to turn away from your sin, and to live a life of love for Him and for others. He will be faithful to you. Will you be faithful to Him?